human. And so really, this is a big welcome to all of you joining us for the Noon and AJ Bell Queenagers Financial Spanx webinar. It's so brilliant to see so many of you here with us this evening. And I can see from the engagement, oh, can everyone mute themselves, please, if you're joining? Thank you. And it's so great to see so many of you join. We also know from the engagement on the posts and what's happened with the newsletter that I wrote about this whole topic on Sunday, that it's really, really striking a chord with lots of you. And I think that that's because a lot of the way that financial advice is framed for women, particularly women in midlife, just doesn't really hit the spot. And Danny and I are both going to talk a bit about how we felt about that. I can see that there's lots more people coming in. And so really a massive welcome on behalf of Noon and AJ Bell. If you've just joined, I'm Eleanor Mills. I'm the founder of Noon and the editor-in-chief. And tonight's webinar is all about Queenager Financial Spanx, which I use as a kind of shorthand for the things that we need to be aware of if we're not going to fall into the dreadful gender pensions gap, which is worse than the gender pay gap, and if we're going to set ourselves up for a decent old age. And that's really what it's about. And so we're going to be tackling all, I hope you're going to come away from this webinar. My aim is for you to come away from this webinar with a really good sense of the kinds of things that you should be getting your head around. And they're not actually that complicated. As someone who's done this recently myself, it's really not as bad as you think. And hopefully this will give you the confidence to know what you need to do and kind of where to start. And I'd like to preface this by saying that I'm someone who's also, and we see in our new research, that a lot of you find the whole issue of kind of finance, we approach, you know it's important, but you approach it with a kind of combination of anxiety and terror and / boredom. And I know that's how I feel when I do my tax return. So we're going to really try and make this the opposite of that. I want it to be engaging, interesting, fun, and also really allay a lot of your fears. So I was so delighted to have AJ Bell's Danny Hewson with us this evening, and she's going to kick off by giving us a kind of Queenager basics presentation on what we need to know. And then we'll be taking some of your questions. Some of you sent me some questions in advance, so we'll start with those. But if you put in the chat any questions that you'd like to have us answered or things that come to you while we're speaking, I think it would be that would be brilliant, and I will relay on those questions to them. So, Danny, do you want to just quickly introduce yourself to everybody and then explain a bit about, and then we'll go into your presentation.
Well, my presentation actually starts with exactly that. So, yeah, if we can bring up the first slide, I'm going to channel my inner Chris Whitty. And I was thinking about COVID the other day. I was back to my local supermarket where I used to have to queue around the car park. And oh, yes, I think we're all delighted that that has now passed. But first thing I wanted to do was just to thank Eleanor for inviting me to come and talk to you all. It's been brilliant to partner with Noon. It just seemed like an absolute match made in heaven when we were first introduced. I'm just going to continue to try and make my screen work, because as is always the case with these technical things, you suddenly discover that the one thing that you need, which is your notes, now that we have the whole screen with my slides, it will not let me bring up my Word document, which is quite annoying. So I'm trying now to, because that is my presentation. So huge apologies. You cannot use a whiteboard without a screen share. Would you mind just jumping out of the presentation for 1 second to see if it will let me then bring up my Word document? There we go. And you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go absolute old school just in case that happens again. And I'm going to whiz it off on the printer. Right. Here we go. Chris Whitty can come back on because I think that's going to be okay. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and apologies for the technical issues already. As you can hear, my printer is whizzing off, so we're all sorted. I just wanted to introduce myself, and if we can just, next slide, please. So I'm Danny Hewson, as Eleanor said. I was ex-BBC. I worked at the BBC for a ridiculous number of years, mostly in television. And I switched back into radio because I was going through the menopause. And that's something I'm going to talk about a little bit more later on. I had an horrendous experience. I actually started going through the menopause when I was in my late 30s and just had total and utter brain fog and a panic of confidence. And if you're one of those people having to stand outside at 6:30 at night with a camera in front of you talking to loads and loads and loads of people, and you don't have your notes, you can't just hit the printer and have it whiz off, you have to try and remember everything, then suddenly that is really tricky indeed. So that's when I decided to go back into radio. And it was at that time I was working for BBC Radio 5 Live, and I was doing their Wake Up to Money program, which is brilliant because it gave me a far deeper insight into business and finance than I'd ever had before. And I also learned from doing that how many women really appreciated hearing about finance from another woman, because somehow it felt relevant to them in some ways. It was like, okay, well, this is for me. And I felt absolutely passionate about that. And post-COVID, I had an opportunity for a new challenge, and I wanted that challenge to allow me to continue talking to women about finance and trying to make it a little bit clearer. And because of that, when I joined AJ Bell, we launched something called Money Matters. And that's the next slide. There we go. This is our brand new website. And I'm hoping some of you will go and take a look at this a bit later on. It's at AJ Bell Money Matters. And we've got a whole load of podcasts on there. The last one we did was with the brilliant Lisa Snowdon, talking about one of my favorite subjects to talk about now, something we didn't used to talk about at all, but menopause, because it is such a huge part of women's lives. So I came to business and finance quite late. I was a business reporter, but business and finance are pretty much two different things. And it was only when I joined AJ Bell that I actually started thinking about my own personal finances. Because working at the BBC, we were very lucky. We had pensions, workplace pensions, and I sort of understood the ins and outs of macroeconomics. But in terms of my own personal finances, I really didn't have a huge clue, and had to do some pretty nifty footwork when I first started just to try and figure out my own situation, my own pensions. And I'll share a little bit later on about how I went about that. And it seemed quite daunting, but actually, as Eleanor said, it wasn't that hard in the end. And it's a huge relief to know where everything is and have it all clearly in one place and documented. So I joined AJ Bell. We had this brilliant team, all women, who launched something called Money Matters. It's with Baroness Helena Morrissey, who many of you will know is the founder of the 30% Club. She's the chair of the Diversity Project. She's the mother of 9 kids, which just makes me feel like a total underachiever. And she is just incredibly put together. And at the moment, she is on a campaign not to buy any new clothes and still looks blooming amazing. But the rest of us are a bit more down to earth.
Yeah, she's also on the Noon advisory board. She was one of the very first people who supported us at Noon, and she's a great kind of fan of our whole kind of Queenager project, and particularly this whole aspect about finance.
Yeah, massive ambassador for women and helping women understand finance. So when we launched Money Matters, we wanted to figure out what the gender investment gap looked like, because we know with the gender pay gap, the latest figure came in at 9.4%, but the gender investment gap is so much bigger. And when we first launched the campaign a couple of years ago, we wanted to know what we were dealing with. And it turned out that the average British woman had less, £50,000 less in savings and the average British woman only had £50,000 in savings and investment, not including property, where an average man had over £110,000. Huge difference. And when you add it all together in aggregate, that comes out at £1.65 trillion. I didn't make a mistake there. £1.65 trillion. That is the difference. So what's happening? Why is that happening? Next slide, please. So we decided to put in another bit of research into the field, and a bit like Queenagers financial Spanx, we launched our research project looking at financial wobbly bits. We wanted to see why men's and women's financial health was diverging. And this is the research that we came up with. It won't surprise you, some of it, a lot of it really is exactly what you would expect, those moments that impact women's lives. But it is still startling when you see it in black and white. So let's kick off with the next slide, and we're talking about pensions and a pension pot. So this is, after buying a house, probably our biggest investment. It's something that most of us have, more so since auto-enrollment came in 2012. And there have been some moves today, in fact, where now auto-enrollment is going to be widened to allow people from the age of 18 to be auto-enrolled in a workplace pension, which I think is so important, because those early years, the length of time that you are saving really does make a difference. And as you can see, you know, the difference between a man and a woman's pension, a man's pension's 40% bigger, you know, £16,000 for an average pension. That is the difference. And it shouldn't be that way, because on average, women tend to live longer. So actually, we need our pots to stretch just that bit further. So we also know that women, they are aware that there might be an issue, but they're also not altogether sure where they stand. They're not altogether sure how many pots they have, how much is in that pot, how much they want to put by in order to have a decent retirement, how much they're going to need every year, and what that pot needs to look like to achieve that. So as part of the research, we weren't just sort of taking a look at these life moments that really cause issues. We also wanted to try and pull together some tips to help women figure out what to do to try and put things right. Sorry, Mary, were you wanting to say something there?
Oh, sorry.
Sorry. If you could just mute your mic for me, that'd be great.
Yeah.
It's so easy done, isn't it? Either to hit the mute button when you want to talk, or to hit the mic button when you don't want to be heard. But the one thing I do want to say is Eleanor and I are going to take questions later on. We want to hear from you then. So it'd be great if you've got questions, if you could share them then. But in the meantime, keep your mics off, sit back, grab a glass of wine, and we'll try and sort of talk you through some of those big issues. So in terms of retirement, I don't know how many of you have thought about how you want to live when you retire, because I certainly have these little dreams where I figure that, yeah, I don't have to go to work today, and maybe I'll be 55, and it's never going to happen. I already know that. My pension will not allow me to retire, the kind of life that I would like to live until I'm at least 65. But I do know that I would like to be able to afford a couple of holidays a year if possible. I'd like to still be able to help my kids, and I'd like to, still be able to get my nails done and my hair done. And that means that I'm going to have to need an income pretty similar to the income that I currently have. And sort of rule of thumb, we always say, think about what you're earning now. Are you going to have paid off your mortgage? Will you have rental costs to deal with? Hopefully you won't. And if not, you probably want to be thinking about having an investment income from your pensions or other investments at around 70% of what you're earning when you retire. And that could be a huge pot. If you're thinking that maybe you want about £30,000 a year, you then add on your state pension, you're probably needing a pot of around £750,000. Now, everybody is different, and that sounds like a huge amount. And I have to also stress that every little bit helps. So if you've got a smaller pot, don't panic. If you can still pay into that pot, brilliant. And it's not too late. If you're in your 50s as a Queenager, it is definitely not too late. If we move on to the next slide, this is something I was talking about earlier, that the financial impact of children, because this is one of those potholes that I think really does impact a woman's ability to save for a pension. I mean, just look at some of those figures there. 70% of men carry on saving into their pension at exactly the same rate when they take parental leave. And we know still a lot of men don't take parental leave, but for a woman, only a quarter keep paying into their pension at the same rate. And almost 30% of women weren't paying to a pension even before they went off and have kids. Now, I know there will be a lot of you out there tonight who haven't had kids. We do know that our generation really had choices. They had opportunities. They were educated. They were thinking about finance. And they might have decided not to have kids, in which case you're probably much better off financially. We'll deal with that a little bit later on as well. But the one thing that we found as part of this survey is that in the same way that conversations when we were younger were beginning to change, conversations now among younger women are also beginning to change. They are having conversations a lot earlier with their partners about their finances, with childcare, about shared parental leave, about who's going to pay for the childcare, because a lot of the time that also falls to the woman. And this is where those gaps start to widen. And if that wasn't bad enough, if we sort of shift on to the next slide, this is the bit that really affected me. And I think I was quite surprised that 1 in 20 women who've been through the menopause then decide to stop work because their confidence is hit, their health implications are massive, they don't feel supported in the workplace, and they just decide that enough is enough. And you think about all of that experience, you think about that point in our lives where actually we do start thinking about our pension. We do start thinking about when we might be able to retire and if we're going to be okay to retire at that point in our lives. And then suddenly we stop paying into that pension pot because we feel like we can no longer stay in the workplace, or we have to reduce our hours because we don't feel supported in the workplace. And this is just a tiny moment in our lives, really. For me, it lasted a good couple of years before I found myself on HRT. HRT doesn't work for everybody, but I think it is brilliant now that employers are putting things in place to help women with the menopause. And I think it is something that we need to start financially planning for, talking about it with our colleagues, with our employers, because we have vital skills that the workplace needs. I mean, there have been so many conversations just over the last few months about the need to get more over 50s back into the workplace because maybe they left during COVID. So I think the onus is on us to make sure that we do some of the heavy lifting as well, that we don't just go quietly, that we actually do approach our employer and say, look, what are you doing about this? Because it's a massive impact to our financial journey. And if that wasn't enough, if we move on to the next slide, something else that then impacts women as they get towards this queenager phase of their lives is they become sandwiched. So if you have kids, you then tend to find that your kids have kids and they can't afford the childcare. So you as grandma will step up and help provide that childcare. So around half of women, as you can see there, have then had their finances or their career impacted by those caring responsibilities. 15% at that point are giving up work because they can't juggle working with caring responsibilities. And it comes at both ends of the spectrum. We call it sort of the sandwich generation, because it's not just women in their 50s, 60s, 70s looking after their grandchildren, helping their kids out. It's also looking after their older parents as well. And it is a huge issue that we know that all political parties are now thinking about. They're thinking about the cost of childcare. They're looking to provide more free childcare. But these are tricky conversations that we need to have, not just with our politicians, but also with our kids, because sometimes in order to help them through tricky situations, we end up putting ourselves into a tricky situation as well. And I just want to leave you with a few shockers, which really just jumped out at us when we did this bit of research. And if we just stick on the next slide, that would be lovely. So divorce, 73% of people who got divorced told us that they didn't take their pensions into account when they were having a financial settlement. So many women say, I want the house, and then they don't think about the pension. And a house is great, but if you need that income to live on, the only thing then you can do is sell that house, and that comes with its own emotional turmoil. And a pension can be worth so much more than that house. And I think that is massively important, because a lot of women, when they're doing their financial planning, particularly if they're taking time out of the workplace to have kids, if their husband or partner has a better paid job than them, they think, well, that's part of my retirement planning. Their pension is part of my retirement planning. And that's brilliant if it works out. But of course, we know that divorce, unfortunately, is a huge part of life. And I'm sure you know people who've got divorced. You may have got divorced yourself. You might have kids that have got divorced. And it is really important that we talk about pensions as part of that settlement. And we were talking earlier about Queenagers deciding not to have kids. We know sort of that baby boomer generation leaving university, thinking about career, and then making a decision, whether it be because they just didn't want to have kids, maybe they couldn't have kids, maybe financially it didn't make sense. Well, certainly finances are now making a huge impact on women's lives in the sort of 18 to 35 age zone, because a fifth of people that we spoke to said that they were not planning to have kids now because of the financial implications. 60% of women have never asked for a pay rise. I mean, this is where the gender pay gap starts. This is where then the gender investment gap starts, because we don't feel like when we start a job that we can go and ask for a pay rise. And something else that we found out is that women are far more likely to ask for those soft benefits. So extra holiday, the ability to work from home, you know, ability to take time off during school holidays, that kind of thing, than asking for better pension contributions or share schemes and things like that. And we also have quite a lot of work that we've done looking at the impact of being single, the single tax. And it is a real thing, because if you are single, you know, if you just think about council tax, you don't get 50% discount, you get 20% discount. You're having to pay the full whack for your rent or your mortgage and your bills. And if you're shopping, food shopping, you tend to find that buying for two, it's not double, not at all. It's much cheaper if you are living as a couple. And it means then you're also able to save more when you are living as a couple. And we spoke to a woman as part of our research in her 30s, and she'd been in a couple, and then they split up. She moved into her own place. She got a pay rise, she got a better job, a promotion, but she still found that she wasn't able to save as much towards her pension as she had been able to, because the cost of being single is so much. And only a third of single women said that they were confident that they can live comfortably on their pensions in retirement. And that is compared to 56% of married people. So I think, to sum up, and we'll just move on to the next slide, it was just to say, first of all, thank you very much for listening. And that's the website where we've got the full report that you can take a look at. You could also find us on social media. But I think, to sum up, even though all women's lives have certain points, certain potholes that seem to be experienced by many of us, they're experienced in different ways, to different degrees, because all of our lives are different. So I think conversations are massively important about money. It used to be that when you went into a pub and had, you know, drinks with your mates, you'd be far more likely to talk to them about your sex life than about what's in your wallet, what's in your investments. And the investment world has been very much sort of stale, pale, and male. And a lot of the jargon is sort of very male. You think things like alpha, a bull market, a bear market is very much dominated by that sort of jargon. And I hope that I've managed to keep some of the jargon out of it. Whenever you're talking about finances, you always find a little bit slips in. So I'm sure Eleanor will pull me up on some of it if I've used any. And I just think it's brilliant that Noon and Eleanor are doing this kind of thing, because hopefully you'll ask questions, we'll be able to give you some educational advice. I must stress, I'm head of financial analysis. I am not a financial advisor. I cannot give you advice. And I would say, if you are interested in finding advice, there's a brilliant government website called Money Helper. That's where you've got pension-wise. You can find all sorts of helpful tips about what you need from your pension pot, and also tips about where to find an independent financial advisor if you think that that would be useful. But hopefully you'll also find some decent sort of educational stuff on the Money Matters website as well. Eleanor.
Oh, Dan, thank you so much. That was really interesting. Megan, darling, will you put us back on speaker mode? I think we've had your please remember this is for educational purposes only. I find some of those statistics really shocking. I mean, I think one of the things that's massively relevant for the Noon community, given some of the stuff we've done before, is this thing around pensions and divorce. And some of you who are on this webinar tonight may not have been at some of our recent Noon circles, but we had a brilliant session with Sandra Davis, who's just joined the Noon board, who's senior partner at Mishcon de Rea, who is actually Princess Diana's lawyer, and Jerry Hall, so she knows a thing or two about finances. But she said that the most important thing that you can do as a woman when you're getting divorced, particularly in midlife, is to really focus on the pensions part. And she said that the worst mistake that she sees women making is this thing of thinking, oh, well, I really want to stay in the house, kind of really being emotional about the fact they want to stay in the family home, and not actually realizing that most of the family money is wrapped up in pensions, and that what's really going to make a difference as you get older is having a really good chunk of that pension pot. So your statistic that 73% of midlife women going through divorce aren't even asking about pensions, I think is really scary. So one of the things, if you just come away from this with one piece of information this evening, that is, if you're ever in the unfortunate situation of getting divorced, ask about the pension. That's the kind of one piece of really big advice from everybody. Also, before this, in my newsletter at the weekend, I was asking people for their questions. And the question that comes up over and over again is this business of the pensions that we've all got, which are in weird pots, kind of, all over the place. I mean, I know that I've worked for the same company for 23 years, but even so, I had pensions before that. And we had somebody who was saying that she thought she'd got 12 different pension pots in 12 different places. So, Danny, kind of talk us through kind of that and what the best way is to start doing that.
My husband recently embarked upon this because I, like you, worked for the BBC for a huge chunk of time. So although I have 3 different BBC pensions, which is utterly bonkers, they all have to stay where they are. I think the most important thing to do is to think back to all the places that you've worked. Make a list, the places that you've worked, the pensions that you think that you had. You can use the government's free pension tracing service, and they will help you find that. AJ Bell also have a pension finder. You're finding a lot of people that offer pension SIPs like we do will have some kind of pension finder, because this is something that we all recognize is becoming a much bigger part of the financial services situation. So yeah, first of all, track them down. If you can figure out where they are, that's you're part way there. The second thing you need to do is figure out which ones need to stay where they are. Because some of them will have generous benefits or valuable guarantees. Some of them might be defined benefit, what many of us know as final salary schemes. Leave those where they are. If you try and move those,
I'm going to stop you for a sec. So what are the things on the piece of paper, or so if you look up your pension, what are the key words that you need to be looking out for, which means don't move that into another box? I had this. I had like half, which was a much later pension scheme, and they said take it out of there, you can invest it better elsewhere. But I had a good chunk, about the first half of my working life, and I went to see an independent financial advisor, and he said to me, don't, whatever you do, don't move that, because that had some defined benefit bits. So what are the key phrases that we need to look for?
Definitely defined benefit. But I think that the handy thing is, if you try and move those, red flags will come up. So I went through that. I wanted to move. I had 3 BBC pensions, as I said. One had a teeny tiny amount in it. I mean, you're talking a couple of £1,000 first few months that I was there, and I was working as a freelancer. I tried to move that into my SIP, and the red flags came up, and they said, are you sure you really want to do this? If you're going to do this, then you have to sign your life away to say that you understand. So there are checks in place that will basically go,
Okay, and I'm going to stop you there just on the jargon, because I now know what a SIP is. It's a self-invested pension
personal pension.
Okay, not right. So self-invested personal pension. So that means basically that you can take that, if you put it into a SIP, you basically take out the pots that you've had in various other places, and you can amalgamate them all together, and then you could choose much more actively what you decide to invest them in. Is that's as I understand it, is that right?
That's exactly right, yes. So it's a much more engaged process. Having said that, it is ridiculously easy as well, because you got funds. So here we are, here's another one for you. If you want to invest in certain companies, but you only want to invest in companies that make bricks, you'll probably find a fund that is the bricklayers fund. So basically you'll find funds which are looking at a particular part of the world, or maybe they're just interested in house building or technology, and these funds are put together to make your life easier. So it might be just on a risk basis. So of course, when we get to this sort of age, in our 50s, 60s, then people will be thinking that they don't have as long for their pots to grow, or for, if the market goes down, for then the investment to recover. So then you're tending to look for funds which are less risky, and they're all labeled. Responsible investor is for people that are interested in what's called ESG, environmental and social governance, effectively stuff that is working towards net zero, saving the planet, clean green energy, electric cars, that kind of thing. So the flags will go up if you are trying to move your pension, and you don't need to move it into a SIP. You can move it into just one of your other pension pots. So if you are planning to move your workplace pension, so the one that your employer puts into, then you need to double check that your employer can still pay into whatever you move it to. I think that gets incredibly complicated. If you've got a workplace pension, you probably only want to have that and maybe two others, so that you can just keep an eye on everything. And the other big thing to think about is charges. So
yes.
If you have,
question, I was just going to say, there's a question on the chat. So Claire said, be aware that if you take your pension into a SIP, you have to use qualified advisors per the Financial Conduct Authority, and the advice fees with independent financial management advisors can be or are very expensive. Is that right?
Sorry, I missed some of that. Can you say that one again?
Yeah, so she's saying that if you take your pension into a SIP, so you take it out of the kind of workplace pot and you put it somewhere else, you have to use qualified financial advice, which can be expensive. Is that right?
No.
Okay.
If you're taking it out of a workplace pension, one that you're currently paying into, that gets a little bit more tricky. But yeah, she said that the defined benefit pension there, if you're wanting to move a defined benefit pension, that is where the red flags go up, which is when they then say you need to seek financial advice. And yes, that can become more expensive, which is why I think we do say that if you have got those kind of cast iron guarantees on a pension, leave it where it is. It is going to serve you better there. If you are just looking at moving other pensions, so if you nowadays you're looking at pensions which aren't defined benefit, they don't have those sort of gold-plated benefits and guarantees, you'll be able to move those without having to speak to a financial advisor quite easily. And if you're only talking about teeny tiny pots, then putting them all into one pot with one lot of fees makes sense. If you have got lots of different pots and you're paying fees on all of those, then you're paying too much in fees.
Okay, that's helpful. So basically, a kind of rule of thumb is if you've got lots of different pots, it's worth putting them together. Then you're only paying one lot of fees. That makes a lot of sense to me. When I did this, and I had to say I was completely clueless about this. When I left the Sunday Times, I had to realise that, you know, I kind of had to go and make some decisions about what I was going to do with various bits of money. And I found it actually quite an interesting I found it quite an interesting exercise, because I was told by a friend of mine who is very involved in kind of different kinds of ethical funds in the city, that actually one of the best things that you could do if you really care about the kind of the environment is to move your pension out of things that might be actually making the situation worse. So I personally decided I moved everything out of anything to do with fossil fuels and into like gender impact stuff and renewables. Actually, it's been a bit of a disaster. My pension's gone down by 20,000 because, of course, oil stocks have gone up so much. But I felt good about it. I feel good that I did the right thing, and I'm hoping in the long term that will be a benefit. But at least then, what I liked about it was I felt that I had some agency over this money that I'd saved over a long time that is going to be my pension pot. And frankly, even if it's gone down a bit, I feel good that I'm trying to do my bit in terms of making the world a better place. So I think it also gives us a sense of agency. And one of the really important things I think about this whole Queenager finance thing is that we can often approach it, and I know I did, with a real mixture of that kind of boredom and terror kind of combined, which is a really, really toxic combination. That's what I get when I'm thinking about my tax return. But what I've found is that actually really engaging with it and thinking about it and then choosing what you're going to put your money into makes you feel a lot more empowered. I mean, that's a word that we hear about a lot, but it's one of those things that in abstract it feels actually really terrifying. But any of you who are intelligent enough to have found Moon and to be on this webinar are completely capable of sorting this out. So I think if we're going through a kind of checklist, what I want you all to be able to come out at the end of this with is an idea about what you need to do to kind of get your financial house in order. So I think the first thing that we've covered is pensions. Find them. Track down all the ones that you've got. If they're in small bits, put them into one pot. Look out for those red flags on the defined benefits. Is that right? Okay, so yeah. Point 2. What's the next thing that we need to do? What's the next thing on our Queenager financial Spanx to-do list?
I would say consider whether or not your mortgage is going to be paid off by the time you want to retire. And if you are a renter, then clearly that is something that we need to consider. And I think this has become even more important because now we have a situation where lots of people have mortgages which have gone up substantially. Their payments are prohibitive and they are having to extend the term of their mortgage. So we're talking about, going to 35, 40-year mortgage terms. And that means that their mortgage is still going to have to be paid when they reach the point that they wanted to retire. And a lot of people now are buying much later in life. They're in their 30s, 40s. And even then, if you're sort of wanting to retire at sort of 60 and you've still got a mortgage, that is something that needs to be factored into your planning for retirement, into your planning for your financial pot. So I think debt is really important. Mortgage is really important. And I know something that some people do is remember that you can take a tax-free lump sum from your pension when you hit 55. By the time I get there, it's going to be 57. Remember, I don't know people's situation. This is not financial advice. And I think before you make any of these moves, it is well worth either going on the government's website, PensionWise, Money Helper, or talking to an independent financial advisor, because they can take a look at your individual circumstances. And I think cheaper is not always better. That's another thing. So looking at fees, sometimes it seems like you just go for the one with the cheapest fees, but then they might not have that customer service that you value. They might not have the options that you want. So I think you definitely need to bear that in mind as well. But also just things like savings. At the moment, people are talking about trying to get the best savings rate. So they're locking their savings up for 2-5 years. Think about when you're going to need to access them before you lock anything away. So ISAs are brilliant because unlike pensions, which you can't get hold of until retirement, or that lump sum when you turn 55, obviously they're a brilliant tax wrapper. And so many people now are finding that because interest rates have gone so high that they're actually falling foul of the tax man when it comes to the amount of interest that is being generated, and they're now having to pay tax on that because they've breached the personal allowance. So do think about that, because that is quite a good way. You can put £20,000 away a year, and that's a good way to be able to have access whenever you want it. So it's thinking about diversification of your investments. Diversification is a real financial term, isn't it? We talk about that all the time, but basically it's don't stick everything in one pot.
Yeah, have some. So what would be a reasonable amount to kind of keep that you can have access to? So if we're thinking, right, so we've got a list, we sorted out our pensions, having a look at our mortgage, working out. So would you say it's a good idea to pay off as much of your mortgage as you can? I mean, certainly at the moment, if you've got savings, is it a good idea to be actually paying off more of the mortgage so that you lower your monthly payments, or better to keep stuff in savings? And what's the kind of minimum amount that is sensible to have in savings?
Rule of thumb when you're looking at savings and your mortgage is, where are you getting the biggest bang for your buck? So if you've still got a mortgage on a really low rate, say you're in that enviable position where you fixed for 5 years before mortgage rates started to rise, then just pay off that minimum amount on your mortgage. Put your cash into a high interest account, and there are a lot out there now, even easy access accounts. Think about when your mortgage term ends. Think about if your mortgage term ends in 2 years' time, and you're going to go from around 2% to around 6%. At that point, you want to then, if you can, take savings out of your pot and whack it on your mortgage. You don't want to do it gradually. You want to make the most out of the interest now in a savings pot, and then stick it on before you remortgage, because that will really help, particularly if you are at one of those transition points with loan to value. So if you're at sort of 80%, 75%, 60%, those are sort of cliff edges where you'll get a better rate of interest for your mortgage. So at those points, definitely think about it. And just in terms of a safety net, think about what you would need to be able to continue to pay your mortgage, to eat, to heat your home, and if you can, have that in a savings cushion, something that you can access when you need it.
So how many months worth? So say your outgoings, your mortgage, your kind of bills and stuff are, say, like, £2,500 a month or £2,000 a month. How much? What would be sensible to have kind of as a cushion?
I would say at least 6 months.
Wow. Okay.
Realistically, because you just, at the moment, let's be honest, the jobs market is still pretty resilient. But if the worst comes to the worst and you lose your job and it takes you a couple of months to find a new job, and then, of course, when you start that job, it'll take a month for the pay to come in, you need to make sure that you've got that cushion if you can. Not everybody can. Let's be honest, I would not be in a situation where I would be able to give myself that cushion. We're talking about ideals here. If you have a chunk of cash that you can put in something like an ISA, so it's got that tax wrapper, it's generating a decent amount of interest, then that is a great place to put your cash, because you can access it when you need it.
Okay, that's really helpful. Somebody saying on the chat, did I hear you saying you need £750,000 in your pension pot in order to live a £30,000 a year?
Well, there is a fantastic article on the Noon website, which you guys have written, and do take a look at it. So a good guideline, as you've written there, is the 4% rule. So you can generate typically an income of 4% a year from your assets. So if you need an income of £30,000 a year, then you would need assets of £750,000 before taking into account the state pension. Now, that's an average of 4%. Clearly, you're going to get sometimes more than that, because if you look at the NASDAQ at the moment, which is the American stock exchange, the big tech exchange, that's gone up 30% in a year. So if you've got something which is tracking that, then, happy days. But yeah, it's a big pot of cash, which is why we always say invest as early as you can. Now, £30,000, particularly if you are lucky enough to be in a couple, that's the sort of, they reckon it's about £30,000 for a comfortable retirement. 37,
meaning you can have maybe the odd holiday kind of. Yeah,
absolutely.
And that's if you paid off your mortgage, right? So that's just money to live on a month. So 30,000 a year, I suppose it's not being taxed, so that's giving you about £2,500 a month. I mean, that's probably, I suppose it depends on your circumstances, but it's not a huge amount.
It's not a huge amount, and you do still get taxed. So you've got to be aware that you will still be taxed on this. So I think the one thing that startled me was figuring out how much money I would need in my pension pot just to have a standard of living which I've got used to having.
Yeah. So okay. So what would you say? So at least if you want to have 30,000 a year, you need to have about 700,000 in your pension pot.
Pretty much. And that's not going to be something that everybody can have. And also remember as well that you will have the state pension.
Okay, so that's about another 10,000 on top.
It's another 10,000 on top. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So I at the moment, we've still got the triple lock, which is obviously a big political pledge, which allows a pension to go up by 2.5% or average earnings or inflation, whichever is the greater. So we should see pensions continue to tick up, but they are expensive. So I think in the coming years, there's going to be a lot of talk about the future of the state pension. So I think it's more important than ever to, if you've got kids, so I've got teenage daughters. I've got a 15-year-old and an almost 17-year-old, and I'm already talking to them about a pension. And because now...
I'm just going to stop you there, Danny. Somebody's put on the chat, anyone else slightly shitting themselves now about the 750,000 thing? I said I totally am. And, I'm somebody who worked for a company for a very long time, so I have actually paid into a pension. If I think about most of my friends, they haven't got anywhere near the kind of pension pot that I've got. And I don't think that mine is going to, deliver much more than that. And so I think it's quite shocking. And it's also one of those things that it's really worth thinking, if you are earning now, you can put stuff into your pension that you can, and it's tax free, isn't it? You can, if you put money into your pension, you can do it without having to pay tax on it.
Yeah. So instance, you're been given a contributions. Yeah.
You've been given a bonus and you put your bonus straight into your pension, you won't have to pay tax on the bonus. So maybe thinking, rather than that new kitchen or that holiday, put that pot of cash into your pension. That's quite a sensible thing to be doing at this point if your pension pot seems low. And one of the things I know from the piece that we've just run on Noon is that it's also really important as a woman to make sure that you are going to get the full amount of the state pension, and you can check how many years of national insurance contributions you've had. And if you've taken time out because you've been raising kids or you've been looking after elderly parents, make sure, or I because I became an entrepreneur, didn't pay into my wasn't getting national insurance or anything, so I wasn't paying into my pension for a bit, my state pension. So it's also really important to make sure that you've filled up your national insurance contribution so that you are actually entitled to that full 10,000, because it's going to become really important for a lot of us.
Yeah, and with that as well, if you're about to have kids, I assume the age of people on here is probably we're at a point where we've got kids, we've got teenage kids, or we're not having kids, or we've got kids who've got kids. But make sure that you sign up for child benefit, because that, if you're off, and that's a signal, and you get then cash put in again.
Oh, do you, by the government? That's worth knowing. No, there's quite a lot of discussion here on the chat. There's somebody else saying that she's 53, she's renting, she hasn't got any pension at all. What she says, it's Vanessa. Hi Vanessa. She's, I'm 53, single with health issues and no employment, pension and renting. What's the best way to build some savings? Great question, Vanessa.
Yeah. It's impossible to know what the best way to build some savings is, because I don't know what your ability is to save.
Yeah, particularly if you've got health problems, you might need all the money that you've got just to live on. But I suppose, I mean, with anything, just putting even if you can just put a tiny bit away, that will build up. I mean, that actually takes us to one of the other questions, which is saying, if you've got a £250,000 pot, if it's just sitting there and it's getting interest, will that, and you're not going to retire for another 15 years? She says, surely 250k will accumulate interest, so by the time I retire or get closer to that, I'll be closer to 750. Is that right?
You were saying compound interest at the beginning. Compound interest is
it's
your
our friend.
It absolutely is. This is why we always say, if you can start saving early. I mean, there was a crazy figure I spotted earlier, which was when the age that you start saving into your pension. So say it's 20, you halve that age, so that's 10, and that's the percentage amount that you should be paying into your pension every year. Now, that is not just your amount, not just you paying 10%, but also your employer and what the government is putting in as well. So all told, you should be starting 10% a year, and then you will have what you need to retire on. Thank you, Martin Lewis.
Yes,
that's his little trick.
Somebody's asking for national insurance contributions. Is the minimum amount of years 34 years in order to receive the full state pension?
Yes, I think that's right. Top of my head, that sounds right. And you can go on and you can pay additional contributions if you've got gaps.
Yeah, that's what I was saying, which I think is really worth. I mean, as well as looking at the pensions that you've got from different employers, one of the things that I think it's really worthwhile doing is checking that you haven't got any gaps, so that you do actually qualify for the state pension when it gets to that point.
Yeah. And just a tip there as well, because I had issues just trying to check my state pension to see whether or not I'd paid enough in, and my national insurance is still in my maiden name. So I can't access the details until I go through the whole process of making my national insurance move on to my married name. So
it's worth checking out those kind of things.
Yes.
So that's a really good tip.
Yeah.
She's saying somebody said that they left the NHS. They've got a pension. They left the NHS pension scheme and they're now self-employed. So she's got a pension gap. What she said, what should she do? Should she just put some money into ISAs and do some savings, or should she start a private pension? Great question.
Easier.
I want to know the answer to that too.
Absolutely. It's easier when you have a workplace pension than to give you that answer, because it's a no-brainer. If your employer is going to contribute to your pension, then, absolutely go for gold and save as much as you can into that. If you are wanting to be able to access it, then things like ISAs, they work in a very similar way as a tax wrapper, particularly if you're looking at stocks and shares ISA as opposed to a cash ISA. You tend to get a better return on your investment, though of course stock markets go down as well as up. The thing about putting into your pension is that the government does give you that tax break as you're putting it in. So that's one of the reasons that a lot of people choose to pay into a pension. Also, I think the fact that you can't then access your pension, whereas you can access an ISA.
So if you're self-employed, and I'm interested in this too, Karen, for a self-employed person to contribute into a personal pension, do you get tax relief?
Yes.
Okay, yes, Karen, we should be doing that. I've just literally started doing that myself. So yes, we should. There's somebody here saying, I want to do some personal finance modeling. I know finance experts use these. Is there a free version of something like that I can use? Is there something, say, on the AJ Bell site where they can kind of put in what they've got and work it out?
There isn't anything on the AJ Bell site that would do that. But as I say, Money Helper, if you go there, pension-wise, will give you a free conversation about where you are. And there are modelling tools available as well. I can't remember the site that I use, but there are lots of them.
It's actually all those kind of details are in the, I just put on the chat the article on the new website, which just went up today, which has got lots of links to all these kind of helpful places that we've been mentioning. So that's a really good place to kind of go and have a look. And it's definitely worth doing a bit of financial modeling, because it might make you think, gosh, I really need to put a bit more into my pension, or to kind of concentrate on it. I mean, I know it's really difficult at the moment with the kind of cost of living being so high. I've just had 2 children go off to university, and that's costing me an absolute fortune, as well as my mortgage going up. So I really sympathize, and that it is really important. And I think what really came out of the AJ Bell research, what I came away last Tuesday really thinking about, was how often women neglect their own financial futures to, say, pay for their children going to university, or pay for, I put lots of money into my children's child trust funds rather than into my pensions, those kind of things. I think as women that we tend to prioritize everybody else's needs rather than our own. Yes, everyone understands about that. But I think that when it comes to our future financial security, that's something that we should be taking really seriously. And I also think that one of the things that we should be role modeling for our daughters, if we have them, is that they start paying into a pension absolutely as soon as they can. I mean, I think that's my takeaway from this, is to get my kids to start. I kind of wish I hadn't given them their child trust funds. I just started a pension for them and put them in there. That might have been a better use of the money.
Pensions are good, but of course, another thing when you're talking about kids is there is a product called the Lifetime ISA, which is absolutely brilliant. And you have to be between 18 and 40. I'm pretty sure it's 40. Once you hit 40, I'm really sorry, this isn't for you. But you can save up to £4,000 a year into it. It is part of your ISA allowance, so that means that you can only save 16,000 into another ISA, but you save £4,000 a year into it, and the government gives you £1,000 for every £4,000 you save into it. You're allowed that every year. They'll give you £1,000.
I had no idea about that. That's really worth knowing.
Now there are pitfalls to it, in that you can only use it then to buy your first house that you have to live in. So you couldn't buy a house and then immediately use it to rent. You have to live, it has to be for you to live in. Or then you can access it in the same way that you access a pension when you hit pension age. If you try and take it out, if you need it at 36 years old, you've not bought a house and suddenly you need it, there are exit penalties. You'll lose the government cash and a bit extra.
But it's good if you're kind of starting to think about maybe saving for a house. Someone saying, what do you think about national savings and investments or premium bonds?
Yeah, I mean, premium bonds, do you feel lucky? It's a bit like playing the lottery, isn't it? My pension is based on playing the lottery. National savings and investments.
Danny, you can't say that to the financial expert. You're going to take that out. Danny Houston says my pension pot is based on playing the lottery. I think quite a lot of us feel like that. It's very refreshing.
I'm determined. Yeah. No, NS&I, they've got some great savings now. They've got really decent returns. So, absolutely, if you want to have a pension pot that you can access, the same as particularly the challenger banks have really gone all out to provide decent savings rates in order to get our business. So just make sure that you don't. Another thing that women have been guilty of is having savings but leaving them in an account which is generating next to nothing. And while that was absolutely forgivable when interest rates were pretty negligible wherever you stuck it, now you can get a decent rate of interest. So make sure you do move your savings. Don't leave it stuck there. But also do remember not to fall foul of the personal savings allowance. So I think if you're a basic rate taxpayer, once you're sort of hitting £20,000 worth of savings on the kind of interest that we've got at the moment, you'll start to hit that threshold and suddenly find that you have to pay tax on your savings interest. It's only on the savings interest, but still it'll be tax that you're not expecting to pay. And if you are additional rate taxpayer, then, clearly you don't get as much of an allowance. So it is definitely something to think about, which is why, funnily enough, cash ISAs, which were out of favor for years and years and years because they just didn't generate as much as savings. That's why they've suddenly become popular again. We've seen a huge surge of people putting money into their ISAs in order to get protected from tax.
No, that's really interesting. Thank you, Danny. I'm aware that we're at about 8:10, so we've kind of overshot a bit. I just really love this comment from Linda Brown. So she says, "Well, having as many savings as possible is something I support, along with many things suggested this evening. Life is unpredictable. We don't know how long we're going to live, what care we will or won't need, whether our children will or not be able to help. I find getting the balance right between living, enjoying life now versus how we can do that in the future tricky." She says, "My plan is to die with zero. I have no kids, no husband. But that means, certainly as far as I know, I'm responsible for myself financially ongoing, planning for the future. Despite having a good financial advisor, it's still a lottery." I love that, Linda, and I think that that's really true. And of course, carpe diem is definitely the motto. But I think you're absolutely right. It's about getting a balance between being sensible so that we can see that, if you have a bit of extra money, it might be good to put some of it into your pension and, use some of it to go on holiday. But it's just kind of being mindful. I think as women, too many of us have thought, I loved it in one of the earlier articles we did for AJ Bell, somebody said a man is not a financial plan. And what we see quite often with some Queenagers is that, a lot of us were brought up to think that somebody else would take care of this for us. I mean, I remember when my parents divorced, my mum could only get a mortgage because if it was guaranteed by her dad. So it's quite recent. I think lots of Queenagers beat themselves up about maybe not having got their heads around this, but we weren't necessarily educated or brought up to deal with this. And I think that that's a real reason why some of us find it tricky. I really relate to that. And but I do think it's something that it's a bit like you've just got to put on your big girl pants and take a good look at it and not be frightened. The worst thing is to be an ostrich about your finances and kind of just hope it will take care of itself, because it really won't. And Helena Morrissey said to me, we did a thing about finance really early on, and she said, little and often. It's a bit like doing any kind of exercise. If you kind of get on top of it and you do a bit of it every so often, like you swap some things into a savings account, you pay a bit of money into your pension, you just have a grip on it and you know what you're doing. That's really going to make a massive difference. So I really want to kind of this session to finish with on a kind of optimistic note that we can do this. Lots of you got some kind of more specific things. There are things about selling kind of paper shares and that kind of thing, which I think is probably not quite in the remit of what we're doing today. What's the best way to sell paper-based stocks and shares? Any offers on that, Danny?
Paper-based stocks and shares.
Yeah, she said that her father had died, and as part of her inheritance, she had like a kind of whole stack of kind of paper shares.
I would suggest talking to a financial advisor.
Yes.
Yeah,
and how do you find a good one of those? I think that's a question that quite a lot of people. I mean, how do you know? It's something that I get asked a lot by friends. How do you find one? Who do you trust?
You can go on the Money Helper website. They've got some sort of good tips and help to find. Word of mouth. Yeah, I always think, if you have a conversation with some of your friends, chances are one of them has used a financial advisor. And I think that kind of word of mouth also then will start a conversation about money, maybe in a way that you've never had a conversation with money before. And I've spoken to a lot of women over the last couple of years since we launched Money Matters who have had huge financial setbacks, and they've picked themselves up, they've learned stuff, they've asked questions, they've had conversations, they've dealt with some uncomfortable moments, and they've come through the other side. And I think you probably find that you know a lot of women like that, but maybe you've just never had conversations like that. So I definitely think word of mouth. And I think another thing which is really empowering is the number of women who are becoming financial advisors.
Yes.
And I think having women in that scenario is brilliant, because some women would prefer talking to a woman. Some women would prefer talking to a man. Some men would prefer talking to a woman. But having those female figures in that arena, I think, is really good. And it may be that you start with companies that have a lot of female financial advisors because they might be the right ones for you. But definitely, I think word of mouth.
Yeah, I think that's really important, the kind of word of mouth thing. And it's so lovely to look at the chat. So loads of you are saying, yeah, there's apparently only 17% of IFAs are women. It's good. It's a good Queenager career, ladies. Maybe you can get inspired. And yeah, and somebody saying first find a financial advisor who gets you your aspirations, your fears, your values. And I think that that's really one of the problems with for Queenagers and money, that so often you go and talk to someone about your money and they use a whole load of acronyms you've no idea what they're talking about. Then you feel like an idiot, and you feel massively disempowered even by the conversation. So I was writing at the weekend that I think it's so important that we change the kind of storytelling and the conversations around this, and that we all have. And we all ask we all ask the questions, because none of us is stupid. If we don't understand something, likelihood is lots of other people don't either. And so I think that it's really important just to start having the chat and make it something that you become more literate in. Somebody says, I feel like I'm taking the red pill in the Matrix. It's scary, but it's so important we know this stuff. Thank you so much for talking about it in a way that we can easily digest. Lots of people love the session, Danny, so thank you so much.
It is scary though, isn't it? It is such a scary subject. And particularly, as I say, I came to this much later in life. So I've just turned 50. I didn't have my personal finances in order. Thankfully, I did start saving into a workplace pension in my early 20s, but I didn't think about it. That was purely by accident.
Yeah, luck. Exactly.
Absolutely by luck. I wasn't in a particularly good place financially when my kids' child trust funds were set up, and I'm afraid I have put nothing into their child trust funds because I just couldn't do it at the time. And I don't think that we should apologize for not being able to do things. We do what we can when we can, and we make it work. And it's not too late when you're in your 50s to try and add that little bit more to your pension or to other savings and investments, and not to panic. I think that's another thing. Yeah, you might have swallowed the red pill tonight, but you've got those synapses firing, and you might go away and you might go and have a look and figure out what you've got in your pot now. And you're taking those steps, and you're absolutely right. Don't stick your head in the sand. Have a look at what's going on, because knowledge is power.
Oh, no, I think that's a fantastic place to end. I was just having a look at the there's somebody in New Zealand, we've got somebody joining from Cape Town, we've got someone in Holland, in California. Thank you, international Queenagers, and everybody here. This is our kind of the first real financial session that we've done, and I think it's absolutely not going to be the last. I think from the look of this, we could have done like an hour on pensions, an hour on savings. So we'll come back and we'll do some more. Just thanks indeed from Northamptonshire. Thank you so much, Danny, and thanks to AJ Bell for supporting us on this. Lots of people have found it super helpful. I've had lots of messages to my phone as well saying this is really exactly the kind of thing that we need. And I think that there's such a hunger for this, because so many financial companies are really not thinking about women, and we haven't even really started talking about, say, child-free teenagers in kind of in detail about how they have very different ideas around legacy. There's some wonderful articles on noon.org.uk about child-free teenagers, about pensions, about what to do after divorce, and there'll be more things coming, and we'll also put up a recording of this. So thank you so much, so many of you, for joining. I'm really really kind of touching on it, and I'm so grateful to you, Danny, for making it so kind of understandable, and to AJ Bell. So thank you so much. Megan, who's been our brilliant technical person, thank you so much for everything you've done in the background, and maybe let's stop the recording now. And Danny, thank you, and thanks everybody for joining.